All right, I think we'll make a start. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you in the UK and Europe, and good morning and good evening to others who are calling from other corners of the planet. The audience is becoming more and more international every Friday, which is fantastic news for the Academy, I think. I am Biljana Savic. I'm one of the Academy of Urbanism directors, and I'll be chairing today's event. Before I introduce the speakers and today's topic, just a few housekeeping items. So Sonia, if you go to the next one. Just like with the previous events, we'll be recording this lunch hour. So if you don't want your face seen or your voice heard, just switch off your camera and your microphone. We would very much like you to engage and take part in the discussion. So you are encouraged to use the chat function. So at the bottom of your screen, you will have the chat icon, click on it and open the sidebar where you can record your comments and questions for our speakers. And please note, we've given a bit more time to today's event, so we will run until 2:15. So we'll have a bit more time for questions because this event has proven to be very popular. So we have nearly 200 people registered for the event, which is fantastic news for us. And also it'd be fantastic if you could also engage in the discussion online about what you're hearing from our speakers today. So use this hashtag urbanism lunch hour and also tag in the Academy. That'd be fantastic. So in terms of today's event, Sonia, if you go to the next slide, this is the second in the two events that we planned for May and June to talk about COVID-19 streets. And this is about obviously how cities around the world are responding to the new requirements for physical distancing, what that means for the design of our public spaces, our streets, what are the longer term implications in terms of how we look at, how cities function, how they are designed, how they develop. Last time we had speakers from Hackney in London and from Auckland, New Zealand to talk about their experience and what the programs have been in those two cities. Today, we're going to go wider and we're going to have an overview of a range of kind of international examples, which will be provided by Mike Lydon, our first speaker, followed by Tim Stonor, who's going to be talking about how space syntax tools, analysis and planning tools can be used by cities. They are already being used by cities to develop their COVID-19 street programs. In terms of the speakers, we are delighted to welcome both Mike and Tim, and it's obviously with this many people participating, it's obvious how well known Mike and Tim are amongst urbanists around the world. So Mike runs the consultancy called Street Plans in New York City. And Mike is one of the leading voices in the new urbanism movement in the States and worldwide. And he's particularly interested in tactical urbanism. So he's written a few books about that. And I believe he's written the first best practice guide for COVID-19 streets. And Mike, I'm sure he'll tell us more about it. And Tim Stonor, Managing Director of Space Syntax, and he's one of my Academy of Urbanism co-directors. An old friend, an old colleague. We've known each other for almost 30 years, I believe. So Mike will talk first and then Tim. And we've asked them to speak for about 15 minutes and then we'll have a longer Q&A. So please, as they speak, record your comments and your questions on the sidebar. And I'll be picking up, I'll be calling your names to kind of ask the questions in person. I'm sure we won't have time to get through all the questions, and there will be an opportunity to actually continue the conversation with our speakers after the event. So that's all from me. And I think I'll just hand over to Mike.
Okay, Biljana, thank you. And good afternoon, good evening, and for us here in New York, good morning. I am just going to call up my PDF here. Great. Hoping you all can see this now.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll dive right in. You know, this is obviously a very unique moment in time globally. And the responses to this has been really interesting for me as an urbanist, as a planner who has focused a lot on using short-term and temporary projects. And I'll get into that in a moment. So about street plans, we have our two offices in Miami and New York. You know, we focus a lot on transport planning and urban design. Kind of the intersection of those two disciplines is our main body of work. But through that, we also use tactical urbanism and placemaking as our methodologies for the kinds of outcomes we're seeking, as well as do a lot of public engagement, a lot of education training and workshops, and a lot of research and advocacy. So our firm is practice-based, but also research-based as well. At this time, you know, it's been an interesting, you know, let's say 20 years, the way that people are starting to expect we call versioning, or expect change, expect iteration to happen. If you just compare Windows 3 with Windows 10, right, you can understand that we have this technology that updates, you know, every year or so, and we look forward to that next improvement. And so we've really acculturated ourselves to expect that. Obviously, changing a city is not so easy as having a push notification, but you know, I would say that societally we are getting more comfortable with versions of things being maybe not perfect from the outset and then adapting over time. So design versus user experience, a lot of you on this webinar might be familiar with this meme. It's a good one that shows that we can plan for and design as experts the best kind of, you know, situation or scenario that we can imagine, but people use space how they're going to use space. And in our practice, we try to really engage with that, understand that if we can try things in a temporary manner, test things out, we can better learn how people will and want to use space, and see the good and the bad outcomes that come along with those tests before we invest resources in longer term infrastructure and transformation. So we call this tactical urbanism. It's a very wonky term, admittedly, but the methods are to use short-term, low-cost, and scalable projects that are intended to catalyze long-term change. And so maybe we can dig into that a little bit in the context of the pandemic, because we're seeing certainly cities move forward with this exact sort of model, this methodology, that they are looking at their climate plans and the long-term goals that they've set forth and using short-term materials to just respond very quickly to the needs of their community during the pandemic. Others maybe, you know, are using the same materials and taking a very similar approach, but may not be intentionally thinking about catalyzing the long-term change. And so we try to make sure that the application of tactical urbanism is about the intent, that you apply it to things that you would like to see happen over, you know, the long term. So the method is iterative, right? So we use lightweight prototyping, you know, projects that might cost a few $100s or euros or pounds, whatever you want to use as a currency, and then learn from those, and then feed that data and the things that we can collect, not just quantitative but qualitative, back into the next round of iteration. So when we started to apply this in our practice in earnest, maybe 8 years ago, a number of those projects have gone through now multiple iterations, you know, trying something for a week or a weekend, and then seeing that become something that was more piloted for a period of months or years. And then now at this point, we've seen a small handful of projects come into fruition with permanent upgrades in the infrastructure. So permanent landscaping, curb and concrete, you know, permanent redesigns. And so it's been really interesting to see how communities have started with a short term and then moved that forward. We apply tactical urbanism in a number of ways. Number one, public engagement. At the outset or in the middle of a planning process, we use the lightweight prototypes to not just think about how we can deliver better public spaces or safer streets or inclusive communities, but use the project itself as a platform to engage people. So by just being on the street and changing it very temporarily, it becomes a moment for us to connect with people who would never come to, you know, a public consulting meeting. And it's just a very effective way to reach a broader audience of people and get some really, you know, more honest feedback and representative feedback from a community. We use it to pilot and create interim designs. So this would be to really take maybe some projects that have been identified in a planning process and to implement them for, let's say, months or even a few years, and see what works and what doesn't, and have that period of time over multiple seasons, you know, multiple conditions, to really understand how a project is functioning, and whether or not it's meeting the goals, and even be able to adjust that project if it's not doing so. And then, you know, when you have a successful interim design or pilot project, you can then have an interim design effort that kind of fills that gap between the pilot phase or the demonstration phase and then long-term upgrades. And then finally, in terms of the scalability, a lot of our work has been about developing policies and programs within cities so that these are not one-off approaches, that you can actually repeat this and intentionally have a way to approach project delivery that allows us to scale up. And that can be both working from the bottom up and the top down and everything in between. So that method, in short, looks something like this, where with a demonstration project, the cheap and cheerful materials, you know, might give way to something that's a little bit more permanent, but certainly adjustable. And then you see the interim design kind of graphic there, and then the long-term upgrade. So not every project, not every city will use 1, 2, and 3 before they get to the long-term. But the point here is that you have options, and you can utilize these different approaches for situations that are, you know, more appropriate or not. So I, you know, I've explained how you would use these different phases, but each one of these, you can imagine, has sort of a column of engagement techniques, of expense, of the materials that you would use, of the longevity, the types of evaluation that you would do, et cetera. So there's really, it's a methodology for project delivery that we've seen be very effective. So let's pivot. You know, if that's tactical urbanism up to February 2019, obviously things have changed. This is my neighborhood in Brooklyn. This is about a block from my house. So that methodology we've seen adapt into something more like response and into recovery. So the response has been, and I'll get into this in a few minutes, has been pretty incredible around the globe. The range of cities and communities that are trying to create safer streets and public spaces and meet the needs of essential workers and travelers at this time. And the materials and what that looks like and how that performs, there's just a huge variety in that. But really, it's about taking that, you know, maybe that demonstration idea, and it's not so much about public engagement per se, although there's components of that. It's much more about really just getting something out there that delineates the space and then worry about the details later. So really in the response and recovery phase is where we're seeing cities transition. I think what's going to be really important moving forward is that once cities are opening up and countries are reopening, that they're prepared to snap back, to go back into that response mode as the pandemic may come in for a second, third, or fourth iteration. Let's hope not, but we need to have the tools and we need to have the materials on hand, and we need to have an understanding of how to do this work. And a lot of communities were caught flat-footed, not being able to move and act as needed. In the States, we've seen two major responses during the pandemic. Initially, it was about either completely shutting off access to public space, you know, it could be cycle paths or to streets or public spaces and parks. And the other was, let's try to open up these spaces and make sure that by removing vehicles, we can give people, or reducing vehicles, we can give people more space to move, particularly in our neighborhoods where there's very, very narrow footpaths. So we started to document this back in late March. It started to be very clear that what New York or Bogota or a few other handful of cities started to respond with wasn't going to be a one-off thing, that this was going to grow as the needs of communities globally became more clear. And so we started to document who was doing what and how and where, and built a spreadsheet that I'll share a link at the end of this presentation too. But what's really fascinating to me is that at the end of the day, we're really just seeing 6 techniques or 6 approaches at a global scale. So hundreds of cities, but really you can narrow things down into this typology, and I'll go through these. quickly. So open streets is about removing vehicular access, except for maybe emergency vehicles, entirely. And a lot of cities have standing programs for open streets in North America and around the globe, where it's more of a one-off type of event. Maybe it happens monthly during the summer, or maybe it happens, 3 times a year or 1 time a year. But, hundreds and hundreds of cities do this programmatically to encourage physical activity and cycling in their communities. That then has now pivoted to be much more about distancing and creating more space, both in parks and along waterfronts. This was kind of the major kind of context zones where this was first applied in many different types of communities. That has since, we can talk more about this, but that has since pivoted to be much more about commercial high street contexts, where the need is being clear as communities start to reopen, that we have to provide space for dining and retailing. And to find that space and to do it safely requires rethinking how space is allocated within the street. And so a huge number of cities have been doing this. I'd say in the last 3 weeks, it's really spiked in terms of the diversity of places. I think Vilnius, Lithuania, was one of the first to announce that they were going to do a city center strategy that would open up a lot more space to cafes, so they could still service people and economically try to get a foothold back into the marketplace. Open curbs is maybe one of the more flexible responses. So communities like Montreal, different boroughs in London, Melbourne in Australia, American cities, etc., have repurposed the curbside lane, and that's either a travel lane or it's a parking lane, and it's oftentimes used for safe movement, to expand that footpath so that you can have space to navigate. But it's also about things like queuing and providing more space for queuing at essential services, or even in more drivable context, doing pickup and drop off. So if you have a restaurant that might be open, you can repurpose the curbside to allow quick access to the curb and let people pick up, whether that's laundry or it's their meal for the night, and then drive off. And we've also seen this used for bus transport as well. Slow streets is what you might have heard of from Oakland and now a whole range of cities around the globe, which is that it's kind of a hybrid between open streets and maybe slow quiet zones or neighborhood greenways or bike boulevards, lots of different terms for it. But it's about calming traffic and limiting through traffic through very simple interventions, such as signs and barricades that block off one part of the street. So you would leave one lane open. So if you live on a particular block and you need to drive and access your property, you could do so, but you're strongly discouraged to do that. So it really limits through traffic. And what happens is it creates an environment where people feel much more comfortable using the street for a wide variety of purposes. It's been fascinating to see the fixed, functionality of people's brains, like just completely morph into seeing their street in an entirely new way just by dropping in a couple cones and a sign or a barricade. It's really that little of an intervention that can change the psychological, feeling in a community on a singular block. Cycleways around the globe, you can see the range of communities there. I mean, no one's done this more than Paris, who will eventually, as they've proposed, get to more than 600 kilometers of cycleways across the Ile-de-France region, and they're going to be using temporary materials for many of those to start. And finally, this is a really small type of intervention, but it really gets at the, I think, focus on prioritizing motor vehicles in our cities around the globe, which is that oftentimes you're meant to press a button to wait to cross the street, and those buttons have been turned off, let's say, so that the walk signal automatically comes up for you. And at first, I think this was done because people were worried about lots of people touching the same button and not being sanitary and spreading the pandemic. I think it's then, as more research and information has come out about how this is spread, it's been much more about pedestrian convenience and not in high foot traffic areas. It's not, not having people congregate on the corners, et cetera. But it's been so simple for most cities to do this. It would be surprising if they revert back to those beg buttons, as we call them. So in summary, more than 230 cities and growing every day. I can no longer keep up with it. I'm trying my best, but I can no longer keep up with the number of cities who are taking action of some sort across a wide range of countries, and this is growing every week. But again, back to those 6 core tactics, which do have variations, and lessons learned that spin out from those. But I think one of the key things is, and I'll get into this in a second, is that the number of cities and the number of applications, there's a growing gap there, meaning that more cities are doing a wider range of things to respond to their needs as they change, going through the different phases of lockdown and reopening. So here's a quick top 10 for what we've been documenting. Again, Paris is off the charts in terms of mileage or kilometers, what they've committed to doing. Montreal is just over 200 miles of changes to their streets, down to Oakland at 74 miles, and Brussels, I believe, is around 69 miles of changes of some sort to their city streets. And so you can see that cities have taken a really large scale approach to this. But also some cities that might be in communities might be very small, might be shutting down a couple key blocks or a mile on their waterfront to allow for more distancing and physical activity. So you can really scale up or scale down the responses based on your resources and your needs. So I'll end this with some lessons and observations. I think the communities that have responded best have done so with great leadership, oftentimes from mayors, not governors or presidents. This quote from the mayor in London, Sadiq Khan, I think is a really important one. It's recognizing that this is a fundamental break with how things have been done around transport planning and public space, let's say for the last 100 years, that we're really going to rethink things. And there's ample evidence why we would do that, in terms of air pollution or traffic safety. But it's this moment now where we can try to reverse a lot of those ills and provide a much better system. I think he's led on that, and also told Londoners, look, this is not going to be easy. This is not business as usual. We have to get used to this, and as a community bind together. And I think a lot of mayors would do well to share that same message. Cities that acted quickly and at scale were looking to their existing policies and plans. They already had maybe something that was relatively recently adopted or proposed, and saying, now is the moment to really put back a city that's better than what we had in February of 2020. And again, Paris is a real leader on that. It's interesting that I had this sort of theory around pattern cities, in that cities look to their peers often, and when one moves, and then the second one will follow. And we've seen a lot of that happening around the globe, where it starts in kind of a pinprick here and a pinprick there, and then all of a sudden the dots start to fill in as the peer cities take on action. So Brussels, I think, was one of these communities that followed on pretty quickly, then set a scale at the city center level that others have started to follow as well, and taking a more diverse range of measures there. These interventions, these changes can be at first very, very simple. You don't have to overcomplicate it. You can just use cones or pylons, right? So this is a good example from Bogota, Colombia, where they have a weekly, what they call Ciclovia, a weekly open streets program that is 120 kilometers in length. And they basically overnight said, well, we're going to do that not just on Sundays, we're going to do that every day during this pandemic. And they've adapted that pretty significantly based on data collection and the response of the people to the changes and the requirements of lockdown. So that flexibility has been really important, and cities can just look to, how do you manage a marathon? How do you manage a bike ride or construction or festivals? That's the toolkit that's already in place. You just need to use it for a different purpose. So there's been really great lessons there. So again, the materials are very simple. They can evolve over time. In fact, they probably should. Cones get moved or stolen, signs fall over. This is not for months and years. This is really about what can we do right now. And then, a real key point I want to make is that small communities are as capable, if not more so. I find working and then seeing the kinds of cities that are doing their responses are cities that already have great leadership and policies, yes, but they also have a lack of bureaucracy. So it doesn't take much to move forward. And a great example is Burlington, Vermont, which is a small city of about 42,000 people in the upper northeast of the United States. and they took measures on 25% of their street network. That's still to date the largest response as a percentage of network miles or kilometers that we've seen around the globe, which is pretty impressive. Evaluating these changes is really, really important so that you can adapt. And thankfully, these materials are highly adaptable. Minneapolis has proved some pretty early lessons in that. And they've, for the first several weeks, they were adding miles and they were kind of tweaking and dialing some of the miles back. And then they were adding more. And then they started to change, like not just doing open streets, but adding curbside pick up and drop off. And they started doing slow streets and then temporary bike lanes. And they started to fast track and upgrade their bike lane system that was already existing. So you can see how just learning how things perform and being able to set up those metrics or the things you want to evaluate going into making these changes will help you understand if they're working or not, or how well they're working. And that's really, really important. I think a lot of cities didn't act at first. They were really worried about safety and the transmission of the virus. And that's obviously, it's smart to be conservative in that regard. But I think a lot of people were concerned about the antisocial behavior that would happen if we did open up streets to people during the pandemic. And I would say that there's been almost no example that we've seen or seen documented in the media about that happening at any meaningful scale. I think, cities need to trust their citizens, and in the communities where the political establishment has that trust with their citizenry, or the places that move quickly and said, you know what, we can manage this, we can adapt to this. So that's just a picture of my 2.5-year-old son and us using one of the open streets in New York City, which has been a real godsend for us, given that our playgrounds have been shut down now for nearly 3 months. Moving quickly forward here, cities that don't have rapid response or tactical urbanism policies or initiatives are really oftentimes caught flat-footed. What materials do we use? How do we do the outreach? How long will this last? Who's going to maintain or manage these changes on our streets? All those questions oftentimes have been worked out before in communities that have adapted or adopted this kind of methodology or approach. And Burlington's another example of that. You saw their response at scale was pretty impressive. It's because they have a real understanding of the methodology. And so that's a really important thing to take on. I think it's going to be important for cities, not just with pandemics, but moving forward, being more nimble and resilient in the face of shocks or ongoing stresses. Having this type of toolkit response available is really critical in moments like this. As cities move very quickly, it became clear that they were not necessarily focusing on equity, but focusing on convenience. And that has since started to change. But many communities were like, hey, we have a waterfront, or we have this big park, let's close down the streets. But oftentimes those who live around those locations tend to be more wealthy and have less need. Providence, Rhode Island, a small city in the US, actually did the data collection and looked at where did people not have access to front yards, backyards, and parks. And then they kind of provide a line of best fit through those communities and focus there first, and open 13 miles of slow streets to be a release valve or a relief valve for communities that need that open space and need to get outside and need to go for a walk and be able to do that safely. So you can see their mapping and their analysis there. The darker areas on the map on the left are where they found the greatest need. And then finally, cities are, once they start evaluating and moving forward, are indeed pivoting towards defining what that new normal will be. Montreal, Ontario, I think is actually the diversity of measures and the scale of the diversity of those measures that they're taking on. Oh, am I back?
I think you are back. Okay. And Mike, we are running out of time. Okay. Do you have more slides to show?
Yeah, I'm wrapping up here. So the difference between Europe and the United States has been pretty pronounced in some ways. It felt like European cities didn't act as quickly as those in the US, but the European cities tend to now be focusing on the interim and moving towards the permanent and leveraging climate and mobility plans. The US a little bit less so. There's been a commitment to maybe for weeks at a time or for the summer, but there's very few communications coming out from leadership that this is going to be something that is long lasting or will be iterated into more permanent states. So that's a key difference. With many European city centers, there was already a more pronounced outdoor dining culture. And so while some communities are taking that on, obviously, the US is trying to figure that out now. And a lot of communities in the US don't have the regulations, the policies, or an understanding on how to do this and repurpose streets for cafe culture. So that's been interesting to watch. And then I think in terms of the scale of the European city, biking, I think is going to be really critical around moving people sustainably, where in the US, as we tend to be a bit more spread out and much more auto-oriented and have, you know, much larger, wider streets, it's going to be about the bus and moving forward with bus transport. So that's what's coming next. And I wanted to end it with the kind of this point. You know, we've seen a huge response to the murder of George Floyd in the United States and around the globe. And we've really seen existing disparities exacerbated at this moment. I can't think of a better image than this one to communicate that. You know, the protesters protesting for Black Lives Matter while people enjoy a street-side streetery. There's a lot of, you know, commentary and direction which you can take this, but it's very clear that we have a culture that is very separated at this time. And there's a huge need to change and focus on those disparities and make sure we're focusing on where need is most and what is most important at this time. And so there's been a lot of debate and discussion among urbanists in North America and I think elsewhere about the purpose of these changes right now and who they're for and how effective are they and where should we be putting our focus and resources at this moment. And so I wanted to really just make that point and hammer that home. So I'll end there. We can talk more in the Q&A, and sorry for going on a little bit long.
Great, fantastic overview. Thank you, Mike. Shall we go directly to Tim's presentation and come back to you? As I said earlier, for everyone, we have a slightly longer session today, so at least until 2:15. I'm happy to do it even to continue even beyond that if our speakers are happy to do so for another 10 minutes beyond, if you're available. But let's hear from Tim.
Thanks very much, Biljana, and thanks, Mike. That was really, really good and given us an awful lot to think about in the Academy. What I would like to do is share both a professional perspective on things, but also a personal one, because I think for all of us, this has been a very personal time where we've been able to do three things that I want to share anyway. But first, this is, for me, titled as Digital Urbanism, because look at us, the Academy, online, meeting in these numbers in a way that we have never really grasped before. And that, if there's any theme through the smorgasbord of slides I want to share, is perhaps the one that resonates most, that there is a new reality that is simultaneously online and on land, if I could put it that way, which I think as urbanists, we need to think hard through. So the three things that we've been engaged in since, well, before lockdown and then since, have been, first of all, thinking really hard, reflecting. Secondly, doing some research, which I want to share into various aspects of living with COVID. And then thirdly, designing, making the change. And I think I have some echoes of what Mike has taken us through in terms of doing things quickly, doing things temporarily, but doing things with a view for the long term. So in terms of thinking, one of the places that I started was to write, to blog. And pretty much the first thing I wrote was about silver linings, because it seemed to me that despite the awful situation that we all found ourselves in, and many more than others, that there has to be something that's good that comes out of all of this. And so I wanted to try to find all of this. This was shortly after spending a week myself. Who knows what I had, but it wasn't nice. And thinking, gosh, well, you know, how do we make things better? And my conclusion was that everything has to change, and everything can be accelerated by COVID to change, whether that's at the scale of entire towns and cities, whether it's about making our streets wider for people to walk on and cycle in, whether it's about the way we create new public spaces where we've currently got tarmac, how we shop, how we relate between online shopping and on-land shopping, how shops have to respond and be better, and then offices, how we come together. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But there in red, simultaneously spatial and transspatial. I think that is now how our lives have been accelerated with COVID. watch the next episode of Coronation Street for the person on the smartphone tripping over probably a piece of tactical urbanism that was put there for good purpose. We have to be aware of both realms simultaneously. I went thinking about the office and about the importance, the essential purpose of offices. And it seemed to me that we don't need boardrooms. We don't even need desks in offices anymore. What we need offices to be more like are public spaces or gardens. So we replace desks with benches, and we create as much open space as possible with a bit of minimal cellular space. And I know it's not necessarily the focus of the Academy of Urbanism to think about the spatial planning of offices, but I think office planners can learn a lot from urbanists in terms of how public open space creates those serendipitous encounters, those overheard conversations, the chance introductions between one person and the next. And that's what we need to have more of in offices. Then I was thinking, well, we're going to have a problem when we all come back to work because we're all going to need to physically distance. And therefore, is that actually possible? Because in many parts of central metropolitan areas, the density of demand is not necessarily echoed by the capacity of supply. And it is that supply-demand equation which we need to look carefully at. So that is one area where, in terms of creating mobility strategies for cities and for towns, we've been doing a lot of work at Space Syntax to analyze both supply and demand. Supply in some ways is easy. The key tool is a tape measure to measure the width of the footway. And you can map that and use color to represent width and so on. But it's also a question of demand. So we've been using spatial models to evaluate the hierarchy of towns and understand that we might have a super wide footway, but if it's on a street that very few people use, that doesn't necessarily make it as effective as the narrow footway on the very busy street that we then need to do something about. So if a municipality has a limited budget, it should focus it where it's really going to make a difference. And I think this marriage of analytics, simple and slightly more sophisticated, is the best practice that we can find to give this advice to our clients, to end up creating those places where we can be confident that there is space for people to move in all modes. Carried on thinking, where's the best place to go back to work? I commute into London, maybe like many people with a commute. Do I want to actually do that every day now? What can I do at home? And again, it's not necessarily for today, but the office is a place of multiple types of activity and multiple types of behavior. And my conclusion was that some of them in green are probably best still done in offices, collaborative, creative activities, because that's the interaction between people. But others in blue could be done from a remote workplace, whether that's home if you've got the space, or whether it's a local hub. And I think for the urbanists, the lesson might be about use planning, that we need to create more local hubs in commuter dormitories where people can go instead of getting on the train. We need to find room for those. And of course, where will cities be in 30 years from now? I think accelerated to a better place if we get it right. This was a challenge set in a call like this in a short period of time, describe the object, the experience, and the service that you expect to see in 30 years from now. And I hope to see them way before 30 years from now. But my contribution was that the object has to be the green shaded main street. That has to be the way that cities respond to this. And green and shaded clearly in terms of carbon capture, shading, street comfort, and also beauty. The experience, we need more of the urban buzz. We need to actually, a bit like Mike's last slide, create streets where people feel comfortable being and don't feel alienated from. And the service, well, yes, I would say it, wouldn't I? But data-driven urban planning and design, that's my day job. Analytics, whether those are highly complex machine learning, artificial intelligence, or whether they're simple spatial modeling, they're going to threaten the established professions unless those professions move with them and harness these tools. There's a lot you can do with a tape measure, but there's an awful lot more you can do with an algorithm. So the second thing we've been doing is doing a lot of research at Space Syntax. We've been thinking about many different ways in which COVID is affecting life and trying to do some research to inform how we might respond. One of the first places that we in conversation settled was quarantine and local lockdown. So back in March, we had a lot of intensive conversations within the practice. And inspired by John Snow's map from 1854 of the famous cholera outbreak in Soho, we said, well, what might be the equivalent under COVID? Yes, we're all locking down now, but as we all unlock, there's a chance that we're going to get secondary infections. Are we all going to have to re-lock down, or might we just lock down around those infections? If we could do the latter, what is the best urban footprint to lock down across? How do you make sure that the community that is locked down has access to enough facilities so that it isn't put into a form of prison, but it's actually just put into a form of containment? And that, although there isn't time to go into it today, led to a research paper where we identified areas we called functional urban areas or neighborhood areas, which we felt were large enough to be providing all of the services that a local community might need, but small enough that the rest of the city might be able to work should there be a localized set of infections. We took London. Why did we take London? Not because, you know, everything ends up being focused on London, rightly or wrongly in most cases, but because it's the place we know best. And so we wanted to work in our own backyard. And we've created a new form of map of London where we've taken account of borough boundaries, taken account of postcodes, but we've said actually people don't see the line between borough boundaries. People don't see the line between postcodes. They understand space, they understand neighborhood. So how can you create this patchwork quilt of neighborhoods such that if one of them were to see an infection, and we took Soho and John Snow and the cholera pump because it seemed to be the most evocative place to start. You could then apply the levels of lockdown that the UK is using, or the Whitehall government is using. And we then radiate out across London. Is it right? Is it wrong? We're not sure. But what we wanted to do was put some work out in order to inform the thinking that was going on. Local lockdown, you just have to listen to the news. It's becoming ever more prevalent in the discussions around how we unlock, but also how we respond if there is an infection. What we've done is carried on thinking at a national scale and thinking what would happen if you had a series of outbreaks across urban centres, looking at different rates and paces of transmission spread, and again, how you can lock down spatially if there were an outbreak in the Midlands, how you might apply different rules to different regional areas, what happens if you have multiple ones. Interesting that Norwich and its region, its urban area, seems to be quite distant from most places. Is the answer that we all go to move to Norwich? I don't know, it probably clearly isn't, but it says something about the national spatial footprint as well. And then finally, I just wanted to turn to designing and acting, because it's one thing to think, it's one thing to research, but it's a whole other thing to actually then get out and do stuff. And here, I turn to my hometown, Faversham in Kent, because it's the place, again, it's my local backyard, it's the place I know well. But there's another really important reason for this, which is almost everything I'm going to show you now was already in train ahead of this. There were already plans for most of what I'm going to show you. And what COVID has done is bring them to a greater priority among decision makers. So the first of those is the plan to reduce the speed across the entire town, traffic speed to 20 miles an hour, 2020 campaign. That's actually 5 years old. And it began with a piece of, I'd call it maybe tactical research, which was to go out with a sheet of paper and ask people to put a red dot, a sticky red dot, on the map where they felt uncomfortable crossing the road and unsafe. And it generated something which actually, when you show it, it looks like a researched piece of scientific analysis. And it sort of is, it's social science analysis. But it's made it the case very clearly that people across the entire town felt unsafe. And so in response, we've said, well, the whole town should be 20 miles an hour. And it's taken 5 years to persuade people, but we got there working with Phil Jones to then develop this into the detail of an intervention. Now those red, the blue line is the perimeter of the town, almost the whole town, with the exclusion of the old London road, the Roman road at the bottom of the town. For very political reasons, had we pushed to have it included, it would never have happened. So we set it either side of the A road, the boundary, and we've got it. So that includes within it proposals to make this happen in the next couple of years. With COVID, it's within the next couple of months. So what we've done is to say, hold on, the Department for Transport's call for radical change includes 20 miles an hour. And therefore, why don't we make this project a COVID project and apply for the DFT funding? Whether we'll get it or not, we'll need to find out, but that's the process happening right now. And, you know, I harnessed a bit of Churchill, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And that seemed to resonate with people. So I wrote a paper, submitted it to, there's a list of people across there, every single councillor I've been talking to, parish council, town council, county council, my local MP, local community activists, so that everyone had the same information. And that set out a way of making this happen quickly. And here we are, slowing down plans speed up, which is a brilliant piece of journalism, because this is the latest newsletter from the town council. They're right behind this, they want this to happen. Part of that is doing a very simple thing, taking the paint in the middle of the road that tells the cars the direction they should drive in, as if they needed to know that. As Ben Hamilton Bailey used to point out, do they really need to know which direction to travel? And just remove it. And then create a surface that now with COVID, we're saying we need to promote, we need to push harder and further, put big cycling signs on the street and turn the street, the narrow street, which doesn't have width for segregated cycling, so therefore turn the whole street into a cycle lane and permit cars to drive on it and turn it on its head. It's a cycle route that we allow cars into. And there's an idea for creating these signs at many locations. I'm conscious of the time, Biljana. I'm going to whiz through. As there are very few pedestrian crossings in my town, so why not have more? Focus on the one with the yellow circle. We went there, counted the number of school kids using it. Why do they? Because it's on the route from the station to the school. So we designed a very simple pedestrian crossing for them, very simple diagram. Then a local neighbor who I didn't know was a graphic artist simulated that and did the design for me. A bit of, if you like, neighborhood design. So why just have one? So we've gone across the whole town and put very simple plans together for building out the street, narrowing down the carriageways, removing this COVID non-compliant bridge. Almost 5 years to the date, I did this sketch in the pub with a friend of mine who's no longer with us, and we came up with an alternative to the bridge. And that is now going through as a COVID measure. It won't look like this, it won't be as grand as this, it'll be a temporary measure, but County Council has started to draw it. And so my role has been to just show people why, if all the school kids are crossing here, why don't we just have a crossing? And little sketches that plant ideas in places. Why do cars go through the town centre? Why not close it? If you're going to close it, you need gates. Make nice gates that relate to the place, say something about its heritage, and that then open and close as gates should. And then we can create the place where we can remove the cars and put in the grass. Now, the planters, now all of this is now happening, but it's been years in coming. The next thing we'll do is we'll make an island for the ecology, a place in front of the station. We might even build a museum to the Magna Carta in the town. All of that has been in train, and that's why it's been possible to do it. So in closing, and this is my last formal slide, is to say, and there's been a day job, and part of that has been working in Melbourne on a fantastic project that is measuring the performance of urban places and showing how they drive land value. My message to everyone is act. Whether it's small or large, whether it's a sketch or whether it's a digital analysis, act, because we all can, and we need to be thinking, researching and designing, acting and talking to those people who can make the decisions. So we're ready for the next pandemic as well, because this won't be the last one. We're going to have to live with these things coming. And I hope that's been a helpful contribution.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And such a powerful message for all of us, I think, to start thinking about how we can locally be catalyst for change, using our professional knowledge and expertise to actually start that change around us in our local places. We have a huge number of questions and comments in the sidebar. I've been watching it. I think that the question that's on everyone's mind is the first question that was posted by Philip Jackson. This is about the kind of the permanent change that may or may not follow from what's happening now. We have, various academicians commenting on this. So over the last few weeks, David Rudlin wrote a piece for Building Design saying that unfortunately his view is that cities will very easily slide back into the old normal. But I choose to be a bit more optimistic, and just based on your presentations, it'd be good to unpack that a bit. So Philip, do you want to come in, unmute and ask your question? And also there were quite a few comments on this topic from Richard Eastham, who was saying, is the opportunity now lost for many places? Because with the lockdown being eased now, there isn't that pressure, there isn't that threat of public health, risks. So is it going to be possible actually now to talk about changes, never mind implement them? Philip, do you want to?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I asked a question actually quite early on, and I think some of the presentations and the chat has actually started answering it. But my question was really to do with that a lot of the measures that have been put into place have been short-term responses to the COVID situation. There doesn't really seem to have been a plan behind it. And this is a situation I've been discussing with people here. And there's no really long-term thinking behind a lot of the measures that have happened just locally here, with widening streets to give people space. And the fear is that it's all going to revert back. And as we come out of lockdown at the moment, everybody's jumping back into cars and driving around again as they did before. And in one of the previous lunchtime seminars, Ben Van Bruggen in Auckland had said this was their experience as well. So where I was coming from was, what can we do? How do we address this? The examples that Mike has all seem to be part of a bigger strategy, a process that's already in place. It's not an emergency response, but the emergency has created the opportunity to implement. And as Tim said in his presentation in Faversham, once again, the plans were there, they'd been organising, and they've now, with the current emergency, got funding and they're able to implement. But in an awful lot of places, people don't have plans. They haven't gone this far yet. So that's really where I was coming from.
Do you want to respond, Mike? Mike, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for your question. I think it's going to be really uneven, how cities respond over the coming months and years. I think you're absolutely going to see some of the changes that, yes, were contemplated perhaps before the pandemic become more permanent. Some of those are even already underway. And I note, at least with leading examples in Europe, that cities are using already an approach, materials, a process that seems more robust than a lot of communities that we have in the US. But certainly, to your point, Philip, that's also happening in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. It's going to come down to leadership, I think, and really understanding that this isn't just about the shocks to the system, that a true resilient city is one that is managing its stresses. And so while we might think that the transmission of the virus is lessening and will be hopefully eradicated at some point with the vaccine, and that we can go on with life as normal, life as normal is not great for a lot of people in our cities and our countries. And so the need and the reason to do a lot of these projects has always been there, whether you had an articulated strategy for it or not. And so I think it's going to come down to that leadership on what cities can envision coming out of this, and with the policies and the resources they put behind it. And I'll give you one example and then maybe turn it over to Tim for some thoughts. Here in New York City, we've had a mayor that's been very slow to act on a lot of these kinds of changes. He's been dragged kicking and screaming into making changes like open streets, which may seem impressive at 100 miles in its proposal, but we have 6,000 miles of streets in New York City. And a couple temporary cycleways that really aren't performing well at all. And that's primarily been it. And we just entered phase 1 of return to normalcy, so to speak. And phase 1 brought around 400,000 people back to work, a very small percentage of people actually who work in the city. And traffic volumes on Monday of this week were 20% higher crossing the East River bridges than they were a year prior when we were in normalcy. So we're going to have a major challenge around mobility. And I think many larger cities will have that issue as well, and will then be forced or backed into thinking about things like dedicated busways and more cycleways, and taking these investments and making them more, longer term around the mobility side of things, because it'll be really critical for our cities not to just completely collapse on the weight of the congestion. So I'll end there and turn it over to Tim. He has some thoughts.
Thanks, Mike. Well, not much to add, but I think what I would add, by the way, nice to see you, Philip. What I would add is that community engagement matters more than anything else that I can think of. That a community that knows why change is happening is a community that is more likely to accept that change because it will have been part of it. And I think so often there's this not only detachment that I mentioned and Mike mentioned between, or an alienation of people in streets where they feel uncomfortable, they don't feel like they belong in streets. There's a similar parallel alienation to municipalities. We think that they're doing things to us that we don't necessarily want. So what's been my lesson here is to have conversations. They've gone on for a long time, and you have to keep at it. You get frustrated and you have to keep educating. But the benefit of doing that, and you have to keep listening, because education is a two-way process. The benefit of it is that when the change happens, people are expecting it, and then they feel part of it, and they will be the best experts to tell you if it's working or not.
Fantastic, and that's a great link, Tim, to another sort of group of questions, and they are exactly about that, about how do we actually develop programs for changes with the communities who are affected by them. We had questions from the councillor from Bilbao City Council, Councillor Bowser. Do you want to come in and talk a bit about, what the situation is in Bilbao and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you to Mike and Tim for the presentation. They were great. Thank you. Yeah, my question was about the citizenship participation process, because I think in all the cities, pop-up measures or temporary measures are well seen, because, well, if you don't agree with the measure, yes, you think that is for a short term, and so you are going to suffer not much, and afterwards you are returning to what you had previously. But the problem is when you want those measures to be permanent, to change really the shape of the neighborhood or the shape of the street. In this actual situation of lockdown, where it's difficult to put people together to discuss about anything, how you arrange the citizenship participation process to engage people in this permanent transformation of the streets?
Who wants to go first? Tim?
I'm happy to. I think there's a real challenge around community engagement right now. Thank you for that question, because it's very hard to bring people together in numbers. And so I think we need new tools for doing this. There's nothing like a town hall forum, but we can't keep having those at the moment anyway. And so we're looking online, we're looking at digital platforms that allow people to have a say. And I think, again, a silver lining from this has been who used Zoom before all of this started? Who didn't might be the better question for you all to put your hands up on. I'll put both of mine. I barely used Zoom. I think I'm pretty tech savvy. Thanks, Philip. You're able to, So there's been this incredible acceleration of digital confidence. And I think that gives us a good place to have digital engagement. I'm not saying it's the answer. It's not necessarily better, but it's part of the solution. There are also many people that we weren't reaching in Faversham. We were reaching the people who had time to come to those meetings in the evening. We weren't meeting a younger community of people who had childcare typically issues, who were commuting, and therefore they had different working patterns. That's why I think the combination of physical and digital is really, really important. So get yourself a digital planning platform.
And Mike, what's the experience from New York on this? It'd be good to hear.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point that Tim raised, that let's not pretend that our engagement before this was strong in most cities, that it does skew towards people with time, older, wealthier, et cetera. That's certainly the case in New York City and across the country. In some instances, the digital side of this has improved the diversity of engagement insofar that you don't have to travel after work at 7 o'clock at night to go to a community board meeting, that you could do it on your phone or your laptop. And there's been some meetings that have by far attracted a larger audience of participation and a more diverse audience of participation because of the technology and the ease of its use. So I think that is a benefit. But I agree as well that the engagement is also best done in person in terms of having real dialogue and conversations about making some big decisions. And I think that's where, again, the temporary projects, we forget they're not just a physical project, they're really a means for engagement. And where a lot of cities have gotten this wrong is they tell you how to use it, like you drive here, you walk here, you wait here. But what they're not telling you is why and what the process is to continue that feedback, or where you can give feedback. And I would say this is a lesson learned from the States. I've seen very few cities do this, but Salt Lake City actually put out a survey before they did anything. And said, we're, as a city, very interested in responding to the needs right now, particularly in our residential neighborhoods. We want to make some changes, answer these very simple questions. And they had over 5,000 responses. And with those responses, they were able to start to, with other data inputs, focus on where they thought the need was the greatest and start to implement slow streets. So, that's a really important lesson, that you can still send things out into the digital sphere, digitally or email, et cetera. You can also do things physically. You can give people a sign, you can give people a wall or something to write on in real time. People are still leaving their houses, they're still going on walks, they're still going to the grocery store. Give people like analog means to also engage there and have a way to respond to that. And finally, with the Bogota is a great model too. They've really adapted their system over the last several months, and they continue to do that. They learned that more people than they ever expected were traveling from longer distances by their bike. And so they shifted where the interventions were happening towards the borders, to the outlying areas of the towns, to get them into the cycleways that already existed or the bus lanes that they were repurposing for cycling. So in any event, it's not either or, it's got to be both and we need to do better engagement just across the board. But just don't forget that the projects themselves, the responses, are a platform for that if you do it well.
Great, Mike. And I want to bring here Richard Easton, who's been posting quite a few comments. Richard, on your comments about, as you say, flipping community consultation around, which is about the timing of community consultation, and also about your comments related to how to win businesses and retailers as we ease out of lockdown. Richard, are you there? Richard?
Yes, thank you. You can hear me okay, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've two great presentations, by the way, from Tim and Mike, really good. And I know Faversham a little bit from some work there, so really great to see those changes. My concern is, well, two things. One, the window may have closed for some cities that didn't act quick enough. The pressures to create socially distanced streets were really immediate and raw for a lot of people. And now this rush to normality, I do worry that the hard sell of creating streets may have gone. Any advice on that, maybe? I think Tim touched on it. There could be a second pandemic, you never know. So maybe this is going to be a recurring thing. But also I think the demonstration ability to show people what it means over a temporary phase. And at the end of that, give them the chance to go back to what was before. I think that's a really powerful way of convincing people. It's such a hard sell with traders to say, we're going to take the parking away, but you'll be fine. There'll be a petition before you know it, and they just don't want to see change of that sort. So I do like the idea of consulting after an intervention rather than before.
Yeah, which is in a way what's happening in Auckland, isn't it? I mean, there is the businesses and retailers who are basically going back to the old normal very quickly. Tim, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, nice. It's nice to see everyone. Nice to see Richard though, because he is a Faversham visitor of some distinction. I always like the word engagement rather than consultation, because consultation just sounds like it happens and it's done and you park it away. Engagement is a continuous process. And in terms, in particular, of parking in front of shops, yeah, you know, that's an old and well understood challenge. And that's, I think, where data really help, because if all those people, if the economy of a local shop is utterly reliant on people parking in front of it, then, you know, you touch that at your peril. But if you do touch it and change it, then you need to work it really well to make sure there's an alternative form of getting to that shop. On the other hand, you know, as Ben found in Auckland and as Transport for London found, you know, with CABE all those years ago, streets paved with gold. The people who walk into shops are the predominant mode. The people who cycle in, the people who drive in are the minority. And so we're in many cases, not all, but in many cases, pandering to the needs of a minority. Let's be really careful about that and make sure that we understand. And that's where data can really help. And, you know, I remember Ben showing me a street where, you know, maybe I missed his presentation, I'm sorry, but they'd surveyed and the cars belonged to the shop owners, not the shop customers. And that one little fact changed people's perception about what the benefit of those cars was. There was none.
Yeah, I mean, in the US, what we're seeing is that the mindset has almost flipped overnight from exactly that. I need the car park out front and there's no way my business can survive, no matter even if you show me that exact data, Tim, still not convincing enough, to I can't make a go of this business if I don't have, you know, X percentage of tables outside. And when you in an urban area look around you, where's outside? It's in the street. And so we're seeing more and more people who would never consider, you know, transforming their parking space into dining space. That is an urgent need right now. And I think what a lot of American cities are going to find out is it's actually quite lovely to have a meal outside in a nice, you know, high street. That can be a really lovely thing. And I think there's also this commitment or this fear or this understanding that people have around these kinds of changes, that it's all going to be all at once and it's all the time and it's permanent. Whereas the reality is you should probably be thinking about time of day, day of week interventions and being flexible. And insofar that you have capacity to manage some of those very simple things like barricade in, barricade out, sign up, sign down based on the use of the high street, then you can be really flexible. And it's not about all or nothing, winners and losers all the time, that there's a real flexibility that we can manage and consider.
Mike, we lost you again for a second there.
There's going to be things, there needs to be an adjustment. There's going to be things that get learned as you try things, and be open to that. You know, you're not going to get it right 100% all the time from the get-go. And that's the whole point. That's why we use the temporary and the lightweight to start, because it allows us to learn. And so I think, again, messaging and communication is so important as part of the engagement and the response, so that people know this. They know that this doesn't have to be permanent. They know there's a way to adjust it, and that leaders and planners and designers involved with these projects be responsive to that. You know, make the changes, because if you don't, then you just continue to lose public trust.
Yeah, as Richard says in the comments, from where is my car to where are my tables? The business's perspective. Great. I hope you're all reading each other's comments, because there's a huge amount of very useful stuff there in people's comments. We're not going to have time to cover it all. There are a couple of questions that I wanted to finish with. First is something that we will all, or most of the countries around the world will have to deal with. That's the kind of the local lockdowns and the prospect of second round of pandemic. And we had a question or a comment from Sandra Woodall, who lives in the United Arab Emirates, and she mentioned the different types of lockdown or quarantine that they have in their country. Sandra, if you're still online, do you want to comment on this, ask the question? Steve B also commented on this. He said, you know, is it possible basically to do local lockdowns given this physical structure of our cities? Sandra, are you online?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the presentations. Yes, currently here in UAE, where we've experienced a number of various types of lockdowns over the last 12, 14 weeks or so. These range from total neighborhood lockdowns, where an entire neighborhood is locked down completely and nobody's allowed out. People are allowed in to deliver food and medicines only, and medical teams going in. So that's the very, very tightest form of lockdown which we had, which lasted approximately a month in Dubai, in one of the residential areas of Dubai. Currently we have Abu Dhabi Emirate is on lockdown, and no one's allowed to move around across the Emirate from going in or out, so from Dubai to Abu Dhabi or Abu Dhabi to Dubai, which is a problem for us because we have a number of staff who live in Dubai and who are working in Abu Dhabi. So there's an element of containment of transfer of people, and the goods are getting in and out. We had a lockdown in Dubai which lasted best part of a month. The first 2 weeks were lockdown overnight from 8 o'clock at night till 8 o'clock in the morning. And people were only allowed to move around with emergency permits. So they had to apply to the police for permits to move in and out and around the city after dark. Currently we have an 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. lockdown, and it's the same situation. We're only allowed out at permit times. But generally speaking, in terms of the UAE, Dubai started doing its lockdowns and series of lockdowns earlier. And now Dubai is getting back to a stage where it's almost completely open now. They've had malls reopened, businesses, the offices have reopened. We're allowed now back to 100%, though we're currently working at 30% to ensure social distancing is maintained in the offices, because we have open plans, so it's difficult to work at full scale.
It's amazing that kind of the changing pattern of lockdowns, and I guess the question is, how can cities respond rapidly to this changing requests or requirements related to pandemic? We've had it imposed with 24 or 48-hour notices. So it's been I mean, we have a number of staff where we've had to move them in and out of cities at very last minute, say, where do you want to spend the next however many days? Because we don't know how long it can manage with, where it's going to last for. So, go back to our speakers to get their view as to how cities may actually, are cities flexible enough to be able to kind of respond to such rapid change? Because we had comments from other people saying, well, actually, in some cases, this is not going to be possible. I mean, Tim, you showed quite a bit about that in your work.
Yeah, they're going to have to, and they'll either do it by force or by agreement. You know, there'll be something on the scale between acceptance and, you know, compliance, because you've got no choice. And that's why it's best to have a plan in place that's been discussed in advance. But I think the fact is that there isn't a one size fits all to this. And, you know, the experimentation in the UAE can be set alongside experimentation in China. We may well go through experimentation across the UK, and so on. And I think the important thing is to learn. And as in the, you know, the articles of the Academy of Urbanism, we're a learning organization. We learn from place. And I think this is just another example of us needing to learn in a very unusual situation. And that's why I think these conversations matter. Chinese cities are arguably easier to lock down because of their morphology. They've got a grid and they've got a perimeter block system, which has gates already. They've already got that in place. There's already a swipe card system in place. It's part of the culture. That doesn't work in a town like mine or a city like London. So we're going to have a different response.
Thank you. Mike, anything from you?
I don't have anything more meaningful to add to that. It's just a pandemic is not something those of us on this call have ever managed actively, or I'm assuming so at this scale, right? So we don't have all the tools in place, and it's something that's so momentary that an outbreak happens and you need to have the nimbleness. But the challenge of the nimbleness is very much a capacity issue, right? I mean, the US, well, I'd say New York, there's been at least explanation that the responses from the Department of Transportation have been so limited because they've had their own number of staff who are sick and can't get out there and do the works. So it's just a kind of pernicious kind of shock to the system when your ability to respond is hampered by the shock that's causing people not to be able to go to work. So in any event, it's something we all need patience with each other, and I think Tim's point's great. It's about learning and sharing.
Biljana, sorry, I just wanted to follow up with one little thing, because Mike, you mentioned fresh air earlier, and I think one way of dealing with lockdown is to avoid lockdown in the first place. And I think the more that our lifestyles can move to fresh air, the better and the less chance there will be of reinfections. And I can see we've got John Worthington on the call. And John, your work in offices over the years, I think relates very much to this urban discussion around fresh air. And I would anticipate we're going to see offices where we open the windows again. We've designed offices for 100 years to look like New York. With all respect, Mike, but New York has a particular climate, which means it's much harder to keep the windows open in a hot summer and a very, very cold winter. That doesn't apply to the rest of the world to the same degree. And we should be opening the windows much more. And I think that will be a way that our cities will look and feel and be different as a result of this, if we get it right.
Yes, and that's a fantastic sort of intro to my final question, because unfortunately we have to wrap up soon. And this is more about kind of zooming out. There's no doubt in my mind that the way we live our lives is going to change, is changing, and is going to be different forever in terms of how we work, how we shop, how we spend our leisure time, how we relate to our neighborhoods. And my question is, what is your view in terms of how this is going to impact the way we look at cities, how cities function? What is the role of neighborhoods as opposed to metropolitan centers, places like Central Activity Zone in London, how the function and the look of places like that, or central business districts in the States, is going to change. Is it going to change? Who wants to go first?
It's a big one. I can dive in and ramble a little bit. I don't think it's still a little too early to tell with any meaningful confidence on my end. Again, I think it's going to be uneven. I think some cities will recover and do well. I think New York will recover and do well. Other cities may struggle. And I think my biggest concern, which I voiced on the very first webinar, pandemic webinar, let's call it, that I did months ago, was that I'm pretty convinced this is going to really impact or widen disparities that are already existing, right? I think that there's going to be more economic disparity than ever before. I think there's going to be more racial segregation or tension or health outcomes than ever before. And I think there's going to be a system that exploits that for its own gain. And that might economically look like success 5 or 10 years from now in certain places. But I think underlying that is going to be an even more unstable and tenuous condition between certain neighborhoods and the city at large, and in the metropolitan area, and in between metropolitan areas. So in the US, we have this popular term of superstar cities, your DC, San Francisco, New York, Boston, LA, et cetera. I think longer term, these inequalities that are so prevalent in these places only expand. And that's a very negative view, or a very unfortunate view to have right now, but I don't see enough leadership to counteract that at this moment, even with the Black Lives Matter movement and its the conversation and a reckoning that we should have had a long time ago in the United States, that we're having now more openly than ever before. Even with that, I don't know that we have the political leadership and the momentum yet overcome those challenges. So I'm very concerned about that, and it's something that's not going to be a great outcome at this moment. So that'll.
You say all the problems that we've had in the past are now much more urgent and much more visible and obvious. Tim, the last.
Well, it's really good. It's a huge question, Biljana. I mean, it's a question.
I know. I think, but we all have to keep thinking about this one.
But it's a great question, and just some headlines. And first, I think, how will it impact the center of cities? We can't afford to abandon the centers of our cities. There is a risk, but we can't afford to. Not only because we've got so many assets at the center of our cities, cultural as well as economic. But also city centres have efficiencies. We still need them. We still want people to travel in and out of them. But I think if I just take London, the real risk to London is the train commuter not commuting anymore. And I wouldn't like to be trying to sell office space at the moment. If I can end on a positive note, and there was a question earlier about designing for disabilities from Brenda, which I think could be the real emblem of the silver lining, which is that if cities learn to slow down, then whether it's at their centres or their edges, they'll be far kinder, far better, far more efficient, far more economically productive, far more culturally generative places. And that is good for everyone of all abilities, and especially people whose mobility is impaired. And so the place I always tell people to start, whatever the challenge, the answer is a lower speed limit, 20 miles an hour, 40's naughty and 20's plenty, I think is the way to think about it. And that would be the thing that whatever else happens should be the foundations for change.
Thank you, Tim, and it's good to finish on a positive note. Small steps together can create a big change always. Unfortunately, we'll have to finish here. Before I hand over to Olga to tell us about what's planned for next week and the weeks beyond, can I just thank you again, Mike and Tim, for the fantastic presentations and for taking on questions from the audience. Thank you very much. To finish, Olga, do you want to tell us more about future events?
Thank you all for coming today. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much. So next week, I'm not really sure if we see the slides all right. Next week, we have the next Urbanism Lunch Hour. Same time is about behavior change and creative regeneration. So our speakers is Christopher Martin, who is gonna talk more about how we can change our behavior in relation to urban design. And then Martin Evans will talk more about creative regeneration. And as always, we have on Tuesday the Scottish coffee break. So see you next week. This is pretty much it. I'll try to be fast. And thank you very much for coming.
And keep sending us your ideas for future speakers and topics to cover in these events. Thank you all very much again, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.